Great. All right. We'll probably give people a minute or two to get here. And during this time, we can kind of introduce ourselves and this program that we run and all that. So hello, everyone. My name is Sarah McAnulty. I run Skype a Scientist, and I'm joined here by Raven. Raven is from the Free Library. Do you want to say hi?
Hello, I'm Raven Wild. I am a librarian currently in the Education, Philosophy, and Religion department, and I am absolutely stoked to be able to bring this program to as many people as possible.
Absolutely. So this is all part of our Science for Change series. We started this a couple months ago together, Skype a Scientist and the Free Library together. And we're trying to kind of take a look at how science has helped us understand problems or situations. And then we try to bring on like an activist or someone actively doing something to help that problem, and then leave you all with action items. Now, tonight, we're going to be focusing on COVID vaccines. And while we don't have activists per se, in this conversation, we want you to go out and make sure that all your family members are vaccinated, are boosted, so we can all have a healthy holiday season. So you'll be leaving with action items today for sure, even if it's just go get your booster yourself. That's an action item. That's really it. That's what we do. We do these once a month. We'll be having another one on December 15th. You can check that out on skypeascientist.com if you click our events tab, and then check out all the events that we have under the Science for Change series. And we'll be having more, of course, in 2022, though that schedule has not yet been released. We're really, really excited to introduce our scientists tonight. We've got Dr. Mike Hogan, who is joining us from CHOP, also in Philadelphia. We're all Philly-based here tonight, with the exception of Kay. That's really all we got. So I think I'm just going to let Mike go for it, give the talk, and then if you have any questions at home, please submit them to the Q&A. We'll be trying to get through as many questions as humanly possible tonight. And I'm going to give it over to Mike.
All right. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you for the chance to talk tonight. I want to acknowledge Sarah's contributions towards these slides. She helped me translate a lot of the scientific data to nice illustrations and presentations that are accessible to a general audience, which is really helpful. And I'll just say a couple things about my background so you guys know where I'm coming from. I'm currently a postdoctoral fellow, which means that I'm a research scientist. I work in a lab under an advisor at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. I went to grad school and trained in studying viruses. I studied a few different viruses in grad school, and then I got into mRNA vaccine research. One of my advisors was Drew Weissman, who has been in the news lately because that lab was the lab that came up with the mRNA technology that went into the Pfizer and Moderna COVID vaccines. So I got to watch that field and participate in those studies as they were happening from about 2016 onward till today, and culminating in the vaccines. And in my current position, I still study those types of vaccines and other aspects of how our immune system fights viral infections. Let's see. Alrighty. So I wanted to give a little bit of background to start about the immune system in general. So when your immune system responds to an infection or a vaccine, it mobilizes two components. One component of the immune response is called your T cells, and these are white blood cells that patrol around the body looking for cells that are infected or are compromised in some way, such as a tumor cell. And when those cells are recognized as compromised, the T cell can literally kill the compromised cell, protecting you from the infection spreading or from that cancer spreading. And what you can see in this video here is a T cell colored in orange recognizing and destroying a cancer cell colored in blue. The other component of the immune response that is really important in vaccination and in fighting viral infections is the antibody response. Antibodies are, instead of being cells, they're actually proteins that float around your body. They're made by your immune system, and the job of these proteins is to stick to the outside of viruses or bacteria and kill them so that they can't cause disease. When you receive a vaccination or when you get infected with a virus, your immune system learns how to make antibodies that specifically stick to that microbe. And when we talk about the immune response to COVID-19, antibodies are really at the forefront of that conversation because they may be the most important arm of the immune system to fight this virus. They're certainly the most well understood, best studied, easiest to measure. You only need a little bit of blood in order to measure these. So this is really what we focus on when we talk about the immune response against COVID, and it's what I'll be focusing on for my talk. So how does a vaccine generate these kinds of immune responses? So the COVID vaccines, there are different technologies that are used in the various COVID vaccines, but they all have the same general goal, which is to take a part of the virus, in particular this spike protein, that studs the outside of the COVID virus, as you can see in this diagram here. The spike protein is shown in red. And this is a protein that the virus needs to bind to your cells and to infect them. So the virus itself encodes for this protein with a piece of mRNA, which is it's basically a gene within the virus that can produce this protein. So the goal of a vaccine is to introduce the spike protein into your body in some fashion so that your body can recognize it as foreign and then make this immune response to protect you later on. The mRNA vaccines, which are the most popular in the United States, contain a piece of mRNA, just like the virus, although it's made differently, and it encodes this spike protein and has no other part of the virus in it. So it's just really isolating the part of the virus that you need to make an immune response against and leaving the rest of the virus behind. When that mRNA goes into your body makes the spike protein, and now your immune system can recognize it as foreign, can make those antibodies that stick to it, and those antibodies will protect you when you get exposed to COVID later on. So I mentioned there are different technologies that are used in the various COVID vaccines. mRNA vaccines they're probably 90 or 95% of what's been used in the United States so far. The other major technology is the viral vector vaccine, such as the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, also the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine. This looks really different, but really the goal, again, is to just bring the spike protein into your body. mRNA vaccines encode the spike protein on mRNA, and a viral vector vaccine encodes the spike protein on a piece of DNA. It's another way to make a gene which produces a protein. And the way that this DNA is delivered to your body is through a little common cold virus that can encapsulate the DNA and bring it into your cells. Once the spike protein gets made, the rest of the immune response is pretty much similar between these different vaccines. And there are other technologies that are used in other parts of the world more commonly. So now you have your immune response against the spike protein. How do we know that the vaccine can protect us against COVID disease? So the way that this is done is these pharmaceutical companies that develop the vaccine, like I'm showing data from the Pfizer clinical trial here. So Pfizer went and recruited something like 30 or 40,000 people into their clinical trial. They randomly divided them into two groups, one group to receive no vaccine or a placebo, and then one group to receive the vaccine. Nobody knew, neither the volunteers in the trial nor the doctors that were caring for them knew who had gotten the real vaccine and who got the placebo. Then all the volunteers go back to their normal lives, and if they get sick later on, they call their doctor from the trial, they get tested, and if they have COVID, it's recorded in the data. At the end, we can see how frequent COVID infections are in people who did not get the vaccine versus those who did get the vaccine. And we can see that the protection against COVID in the first 3 months was about 90%. And later on, by about 6 months, it was about 80%. That's in the Pfizer trial. So this is all COVID cases, mild and severe. But they had some symptoms in these cases. In the Moderna clinical trial, they did basically the same exact design of the trial. And they saw even better protection against COVID. It was about 90% after 6 months. And J&J did the same thing and saw 80% protection against mild or severe COVID. In the case of these two mRNA vaccines, Moderna and Pfizer, the protection against severe disease is much greater than the protection against mild disease. This makes sense because there's different arms of the immune response, like those T cells I mentioned, that can step in and help when the antibody response is not sufficient to protect you. And we've seen, even with the Delta variant, even after 6 months, these vaccines prevent more than 95% of cases of severe COVID. So as a result, they have saved many, many lives in this pandemic. Probably something on the order of 1 million Americans' lives have been saved by these vaccines, assuming the pandemic can resolve as we expect it to. And so this has been really a wonderful medical intervention to respond to COVID. I just want to mention these vaccines are not perfect. Any immune response naturally will wane over time. Not completely, but it will start to decrease and then level out at a certain point. So we expect that for these vaccines, and that's what we saw. And that's why we now have this conversation about booster shots. Boosters are not unique to COVID vaccines. The MMR vaccine for measles, mumps, and rubella also is a 3-shot series. I think the HPV vaccine, if I remember correctly, is a 3-shot series. So sometimes you need a 3rd shot to generate maximum immunity. And it's even more complicated with COVID because of variants. But basically what I'm showing here is that when a 3rd shot is given to people who got the Pfizer vaccine in this case, their protection from hospitalization and death was increased dramatically relative to the people who got only 2 shots. So this is specifically a population of people who had gotten their initial vaccination 6 months earlier. They were starting to have their immune responses waning. The people who start to become vulnerable to severe disease after this time is mainly elderly people, people who live in nursing homes or people who have chronic conditions. The people who are most at risk of COVID start to become more at risk 6 months after vaccination or 4 months after vaccination. But if you give those people a booster shot, they now have really good protection again. Booster shots are controversial right now because we still have a limited global supply of these vaccines. But I'm just starting to see reports now that the global supply is starting to catch up with demand in certain countries that have had trouble with supply earlier. For example, South Africa, which has been in the news because of the Omicron variant spreading there, they now have enough vaccines to meet their demand. And they're now, like the United States, their main issue is convincing their population to go get the vaccine at high enough levels. And as a result of these data and everything I mentioned, the CDC in the United States is now recommending booster shots to all adults 18 years old and older. So they're basically now saying everyone should go get their vaccination, and then after 6 months for the mRNA vaccines or 2 months for J&J, go get a booster shot, and you can mix and match a little bit. You can get either Pfizer or Moderna after any of the other shots. How am I doing on time? Good. So the reason why the booster shots are so useful, I'm trying to depict the way that they increase the antibody response here. So these are graphs that I drew that summarize a bunch of data from this paper I'm citing on the bottom of the slide here. Basically, your initial vaccination generates antibodies against the original COVID virus, and it generates a response, but a lower response against variants. That's going to wane a little bit over time, and then in some people, you become susceptible to infection again. Most people are still protected from severe disease. But if you give a booster shot, now you have antibody levels against all COVID strains that are much, much higher than what you had after the second shot. So it's not just bringing you back up to what you had before. It's not just catching up. It's actually far exceeding the immunity that you had after the second shot. And that also applies to the variants. So the best way to get immunity to the variants is really to get that 3rd shot. I wanted to mention safety for these vaccines. So the safety record for all of the COVID vaccines is as good or better than the safety record for all other vaccines on the market, as far as I have seen. They've been shown safe in the clinical trials in old people, young people, pregnant people. That data came out a little bit later, and diverse populations in the US and around the world. There are some rare severe reactions that can happen. This is any vaccine. First, you look at the common side effects, and then you look at what are the rare severe reactions. For the COVID vaccines, we see cases of anaphylaxis. A few people in a million will get anaphylaxis, but it's totally treatable by a pharmacist when you're sitting at the clinic and get your vaccine. Some younger people got some heart inflammation after the mRNA vaccines, but as far as I can tell, all of those cases resolved. Those kids didn't have any long-term problems. Again, as far as I have seen in scientific reports, and so really there are not any long-term or severe reactions to the mRNA vaccines that I have seen at all that I would be worried about. The J&J vaccine did have rare blood clots, about 1 in a million, and that is probably the most significant of all of these side effects. Most of those reactions were in younger women, and so I would say if you're in that category, you might want to consider getting one of the mRNA vaccines, which did not have that reaction. And then finally, I wanted to mention this question of late appearing severe reactions. So the number one concern that I hear about COVID vaccines is that if we study them for 2 to 6 months, how could we possibly know if there are severe reactions that can occur many months or years later? Many people worry about this question. And if that were possible, if that were a thing that happened to vaccines, I would understand that concern. But really what I want to emphasize tonight on the safety question is that these late appearing reactions, as far as I know, have never been reported for any vaccine, ever. There are rare reactions to vaccines, but they always happen in conjunction with the immune response. Your immune response develops in the first few days to weeks after vaccination. After 6 months, or even a lot less than that, even after 2 months, your immune response is done doing what it's going to do. It's not going to do anything different after that point. So there's no reason to think that it could start causing a problem later. And it certainly there would be no reason to think that would be any worse for a vaccine than any of the dozens or hundreds of other infections that we get throughout our lives. So basically, these late appearing reactions don't happen to vaccination. The other point I want to make here is that some people make this risk-benefit analysis, and they say, well, I'm a little bit worried about the vaccine, so I just want to avoid any exposure. I want to avoid the vaccine, I want to avoid the virus. But it's not a realistic choice to pick between the vaccine and doing nothing. Your choice is going to be between the vaccine and the virus, because this virus is so contagious that virtually every human on Earth will be exposed to COVID-19 eventually. It's that contagious. It will be here forever, at least at some level, and we're all going to get exposed to it eventually. So the choice that you need to make is between the virus and the vaccine. And I'm not making a political statement here. The scientific conclusion that we know from all of these studies that we've done over the past almost 2 years is that the virus is far, far more dangerous than the vaccine in every population. So we've all lived through this pandemic, COVID-19, but I just want to mention that this is something that scientists have been expecting can and will happen. There are so many viruses that circulate in animals around the world that have the potential to jump to humans and cause future pandemics. So really, I want to impress upon you the importance of preparing for future pandemics. Nobody wants to go through what we just went through for COVID ever again. I certainly don't. So what we need to do to prepare for that is to start developing vaccines now against viruses that have the potential to cause future pandemics. if we make those vaccines now and we start testing them for safety and how strong the immune responses are in humans now, then when we get future epidemics, we can roll them out and they'll already be vetted, and we can protect people without society-wide shutdowns. And there's many other things that we can add on top of vaccines to add additional layers of protection. One is better antiviral drugs. These are just starting to come out now for COVID, but it took a long time. The best one I heard about is this pill from Pfizer, that if you take this pill, I think it's either over the counter or a normal pharmacy pill, after you get a COVID diagnosis, it prevents severe disease in the vast majority of cases, but you have to take it early. It's just starting to come out. I don't know if it's available in pharmacies now, but it will be very soon, if not now. We need better diagnostic tests so people can accurately figure out who has infectious diseases really, really quickly. And we need this to work for many different viruses. And we need to get ready in terms of our materials, stockpiles of materials and supply chains, so that we're not totally taken off guard next time one of these things happen. I'm kind of optimistic about this. As long as there's enough funding for these things and leadership from governments around the world, from a technology and from the scientific perspective, we totally have the ability to develop these solutions and prevent disasters like this from happening again. So I don't want to scare you that we have other viruses out there that can cause pandemics. I just want to motivate you to continue to care about this, because we need funding and leadership for this to prevent it from happening again. You might be wondering, when is COVID-19 going to end? So the other good news is that it will end eventually. It won't disappear from the earth completely. That is very unlikely, but it will eventually slow down considerably when we reach what's called herd immunity. Herd immunity is when you have, in the case of COVID, it's going to be after 90 or 95% of people, or maybe more, I'm not sure the number, after the vast majority of people are immune to COVID, whether because of vaccination or infection, there'll be enough immunity that the virus won't have targets to spread around society, and it will just kind of peter out, and it will be in little pockets around the world, not in major epidemics. We don't know exactly when this will happen, but it will happen. A couple of possibilities that can happen in the future are if the virus fades away into the background, it only pops up here and there. Or it's possible that we may get infected and reinfected with different variants over time, many times over. But in either of these cases, because we're going to be building up immunity more and more through vaccination, potentially breakthrough infections, etc., our immunity is going to continue to increase, and the threat from the virus is going to decrease. It's going to become not a really dangerous virus for the vast majority of people, except maybe the most at risk. And now we have this variant called Omicron that's coming onto the scene. So there's really not a lot we know about this virus. I just heard about it a few days ago myself. We just know that it's spreading very quickly in South Africa, and it's been now detected in a bunch of other countries around the world. The worrying thing is that it appears to be overtaking Delta, the Delta variant in South Africa, which means that it might be more infectious, more contagious. But we have yet to see that happen in other countries around the world, but it's quite likely that it will happen. It also has a lot of mutations in its spike protein, which allows it to avoid those sticky antibodies from latching onto it. We don't have any scientific data to show that yet, but based on the mutations, which we know about, we can suspect that this is likely to happen. So we're kind of like in this gray area where we need to be concerned about it, but we don't yet know how bad it is, or if it's bad at all. These kinds of variants have the potential to cause worse disease, or they have the potential to cause less disease. We simply don't know yet. And will the vaccines work against it? We don't know the exact level of protection that we'll get, but it's almost certainly the case that we'll get partial protection from the current vaccines, since we've seen that for every other variant so far. And it's almost a certainty that the booster vaccination will provide even better protection. So the best way that we in the US, we around the world, can prepare for Omicron and any other potentially scary variants that can come in the future is to vaccinate now if we're not vaccinated already, and then go and get that booster shot. That's going to be, if we want to minimize the spread of the virus and if we want to minimize disruptions to the economy, that is the single best thing that can be done to slow the spread of the virus and all of its associated disruptions. And that's basically the end of my talk. So now it's only 7:25, and I think we have a lot of time for questions.
Awesome. That was so great, Mike. Thank you so much for sharing all that with us. We already have a lot of questions, so let's get into it. So we've got our first question from Danielle Delat. If someone has already had COVID, does getting the vaccine matter?
Yes, it does matter. So this also is a question that comes up a lot. COVID infection does give you some immunity, but in all the studies that I've seen, and we've actually known this for about a year now, the immunity that you get from vaccines is better than the immunity that you get from COVID infection, at least in terms of the antibody response. So you're probably more protected from future exposures to COVID later on by vaccination, but even more importantly, you're less likely to pass the virus on to other people if you go get vaccinated after getting COVID. So you're protecting yourself, and you're also protecting other people around you by getting vaccinated, even after you've had COVID. I think I would expect it to function like the first shot. So now you're just going to expand that immunity more. You're going to have better immunity to variants, and the more vaccination, the better and the broader the immune response.
Sounds good. All right, thank you. Let's see. The next question is about dosing. So this person says that she's a 100-pound female and is wondering, like, everybody's getting the same dosage of this vaccine. Does it really matter? Like, does your body size matter for the amount that you get, like it might with other drugs?
It's a really good question. I've never seen a study like that done for vaccines. It might have been done, but I have not seen that. The reason is because vaccines don't work the same way that other drugs do. So if you take, like, I don't know, aspirin or something, the drug within a pill of aspirin is going to spread around your body, and the smaller that you are, the higher the concentration of the drug within your body. So that means it's going to work more, but it's also going to have more side effects. And so you probably want to give a lower dose to a smaller person. A vaccine doesn't spread throughout your body like that. It usually stays, it can spread a little bit, but really its job is to stay in the area that's injected and go to your lymph nodes that are next to your arm, that are places in your body where your immune system makes antibody responses. And so that process is basically going to work more or less similarly in people of different sizes. But that being said, it's possible that people of different sizes could have different reactions to the vaccine. If you're really, really worried about it, you might ask your doc. Well, for one thing, I think the Pfizer vaccine has a lower side effect profile than the Moderna shot, and it also has a lower overall dose of the active ingredients. So for one, I would consider starting with Pfizer instead of Moderna if you're worried about that. I believe there are child doses of the vaccines out now. I don't know if adults can get that. I don't know if a doctor would give that. It's worth asking about because it's certainly better than not getting vaccinated at all. But I would probably start with looking at the Pfizer vaccine.
Awesome. Thank you. Next question is from Melanie. Why does a booster provide greater immunity than the second shot? Is it because more variants have been taken into account with the booster and the formula was adjusted? Question mark.
That's also a good question. So the vaccine is actually the same. Nothing's changed between the booster and the second shot in terms of like the ingredients in the vaccine. And some of them it's a lower dose. Like I think in the Moderna shot, they give a half dose for the booster just because they don't need to use a full dose to have a maximum effect. But the vaccine itself has the same ingredients. What happens is your immune, so the antibodies that your body makes against a vaccine is produced by a cell in your body called a B cell. They live in your blood, they live in your lymph nodes. And when you receive a first shot of a vaccine, your B cells will multiply a little bit, and then those B cells will make antibodies. If you get a second shot, all of those B cells from the first shot will multiply more, and now you have maybe 10 times as many B cells making antibodies than after the first shot. And now if you get a third shot, those B cells will multiply again, and you now have 100 times as many B cells making antibodies as you had after the first shot. So it's this iterative process where you continually expand the number of B cells that are making antibodies, and just by increasing the level of antibodies within your system, there's a greater likelihood that they'll be able to stick to any COVID virus that you might encounter and prevent it from infecting, or to dampen infections and prevent severe disease.
All right. So our next question is from Sue, who is currently taking an immunosuppressant for colitis. Is that a reason that she should not get a booster, or more of a reason why she should get a booster?
So I've looked into, so I have to say that in the original clinical trials, people who were immune suppressed and also people who were pregnant were not part of the original population. These are, for all drugs or vaccines, these are considered high-risk groups that basically are studied later on after it's determined to be safe in a general population. But now we have data starting to come out, actually not starting to come out, we've had data coming out studying immune suppressed people, showing that the vaccine in the vast majority of them is safe. That being said, immune suppressants can be, some populations that are immune suppressed, such as organ transplant recipients, might have very specific conditions that might make a vaccine reaction worse for them. So I would recommend people who have very severe conditions to talk to their doctor and see what they would recommend. But there's no data available yet to show that people who have, like let's say a moderate autoimmune condition like colitis, taking an immune suppressant would, I don't know if this is a moderate case or severe, but it's not an organ transplant at least. So someone having an immune suppressant treatment like that, I haven't seen any data that would be concerning about safety. I would certainly double check with your doctor to be safe, but so far it seems like the more important issue in those populations is how strong the immune response is, not how safe it is. I hope I answered the right question there.
Awesome. Our next question comes from Sally. So long story short, Sally lives in Canada and is dealing with a lot of folks who are listening to, let's say, some bad faith actors. And she wants to know, how can we debunk what a lot of people are hearing? She's a nurse and running into a lot of resistance, specifically dealing with people concerned about long-term effects, like you mentioned today, and that, nothing's been tested prior to COVID. Do you have any advice for what to tell people?
That's so hard. I don't really know the best way to convince people, but there's a reason why I mentioned that issue, because like this questioner has mentioned, I hear this all the time. A lot of people are trying to be skeptical and are trying to approach the vaccines in a skeptical way, as you kind of should if you're getting any kind of medical intervention or drug. But I think the piece of information that they're missing is that long-term effects that you don't see for months and then appear magically later on, it's not a realistic concern for the COVID vaccines because it's never been seen for any vaccine. That's not a talking point that I really ever hear. I don't think I've ever heard somebody, any of the pundits, any of the people talking on the news who are trying to defend vaccines. I don't think anyone has said that I've heard. So I think it's not something that people really realize. A lot of times people who have skepticism of vaccines are just sort of shut down, like, you're crazy to worry about this, you're crazy to be skeptical of it. I would say it's not crazy to be skeptical. It's rational to be skeptical. But the information that you need to take into consideration is, like, you need to worry about the right things. for maybe a drug that you take for decades, you might worry about long-term effects. But for a vaccine that generates an immune response that only is generated over the course of several weeks, the only window that you're worried about in that situation is the short-term window. And we have studied that short-term window so thoroughly. So yeah, that's what I would focus on, is the fact that long-term effects don't appear for vaccination. Yeah, that's what I would go back to.
All right. So our next question from Keiko is, what is the main reason why we are recommended a booster shot in a short time period to compare it to immunization shot, like some immunization that we can take once or twice in a lifespan, or a few years apart? So why the 3 months or the 9 months versus the once every several years?
So I would say that the COVID vaccine booster is more like a typical it's actually quite similar to a typical third shot of a vaccine. I want to say that the HPV vaccine, which is a 3-dose series, you get it, when you first walk into the doctor, and then you get it 2 months later, and you get it 6 months later. We have some people nodding their heads here. I think that's what they did for me when I got that. That's because I think you want to get the second shot relatively soon after the first shot, because you really want your immunity to be expanded soon, so you get the protection soon. But like I mentioned, immune responses wane slowly over time. They don't just drop off a cliff over the first couple months. They start to wane slowly. So you have a lot of protection in the first several months. It was only after about 6 months, 4 to 6 months, that we started in the COVID pandemic to see the immunity decreasing enough so that protection decreased. So that's the point in time where people were like, here's when the booster shot will help us. This is when it's basically necessary or helpful. So that's where the time frame comes from. Other vaccines that maybe you would get many, many years after an earlier shot, the ones that I'm thinking of are like tetanus. Thank you. Yeah. I would say that that's more of like an exceptional case, because first of all, the tetanus vaccine, it's not associated with like a massive immune response as far as I know. They think it might wane over time, so you just need to continually, I forget the recommendations, but it's one of those ones that you have to just maintain at a certain level, especially if you're at risk. But the COVID vaccine recommendations are really just based on when it's necessary, when it's helpful. And I think that general rule is the same rule that's applied to all of the other vaccines. Whatever the time frame that's recommended, it's the time frame that was found to be associated with the best efficacy, the best protection.
Awesome, thank you. Next one's from Tara. How about mixing vaccines? If you originally received Moderna, should you receive another Moderna for your booster, or should we be trying to mix and match?
I would say that you should go to, okay, I'll start with the science, and then I'll go into shoulds and woulds and stuff. The science shows that the antibody response to the Moderna is the highest out of the three. It's a little bit higher for Moderna than it is for Pfizer. Pfizer still makes an excellent antibody response. I had 3 shots of Pfizer. J&J makes a lower response, but it's still a good immune response. It's just these mRNA vaccines, this new technology has just generated these really awesome immune responses. So it's sort of like kind of like not a very fair comparison, but J&J is the lowest of the 3, and so that's probably one where you really want to consider getting either Moderna or Pfizer as your booster. You can also get J&J as a booster for that. But how to pick between them, like picking between Moderna and Pfizer since they're so close, I would say do what works best for you. Do you want to have like the maximum immune response, but you don't mind having a little bit worse side effects? Then I would say Moderna. If you had bad side effects the first time, or you really can't tolerate that, or you can't take a day off from work, but you want to boost your immunity, I think Pfizer makes more sense.
All right. We have another question here. Why would the vaccines cause blood clots? I've heard this reaction, but never knew the cause of why this could happen. Is the vaccine reacting to a specific protein in a person's blood?
I don't think the cause is known, but it seems to be specific to, I should say the cause is not known, but it seems to be specific to the common cold viruses that are used in the Johnson & Johnson and the AstraZeneca vaccines. It's a similar technology there. Something about the common cold virus being injected appears to trigger some immune problem that triggers a blood clot. I can't really give any more details because I don't understand it any more than that, and I don't think the field at large understands it more than that at this point.
Awesome, thanks. Next question's from Catherine. Why do mRNA vaccines generate a stronger immune response than a DNA vector vaccine? And what do I say to people who argue that the mRNA technology is too new?
Well, okay, so first of all, new is not a criticism. It doesn't matter if it's new or old. If it works well and it's proven to be safe, I think it's great. I think the mRNA, so the first time that scientists injected mRNA into any animal to see what kind of immune response was generated or to see what it did was, I think, in the 90s. And then my grad school lab, the lab of Drew Weissman and Katie Carrico, worked on how to make mRNA work better for different kinds of therapies, including vaccines. And that they had some breakthroughs in the mid 2000s. And then we got off to like this really great, we really figured it out around 2015 or so, 2015, 2016. So yeah, it's a little bit new, but it works well and it makes a great, and it's safe. It makes a great immune response and it's very safe. So the newness to me isn't a flaw. There are a lot of things that are new that are also great. The other part of the question was, why is it better than DNA vaccines or maybe a viral vector vaccine that contains DNA? Now we're getting into intricacies of how the immune response works. So coming from the mRNA vaccine field, we're actively studying why the immune response is so strong against mRNA vaccines. There's probably many, many different reasons for this. Sarah mentioned that she would send out a link to further reading. And so the 2021 review, Sarah, is if that link is sent out, that provides an excellent explanation of what we as a field know so far about exactly what kind of immune response is generated by these vaccines, these mRNA vaccines, and how it differs from other immunizations, why it's better. So I won't go into like too many details about that, but basically it has to do with what kinds of T cells are activated, how B cells get activated to make antibodies, maybe how long the mRNA stays in your body to make the spike protein, so it can like continually stimulate your immune response. And then the mRNA is encapsulated in this lipid droplet that delivers the mRNA to cells, but it also promotes the immune response. And we don't know exactly how it does that. It just works really well at promoting the immune response. So that's like a super active area of research in my lab and other labs around us.
That extra reading is now in the chat. So if you're interested in that, we've got lots of different extra reading that you can dig into. Have fun.
All right. So let's see. Omicron has a high level of mutagens compared to previous variants. Is it possible some of those mutations cancel each other out, so it is not as bad as it seems?
Yeah, so there are some mutations that we can see in the genetic sequence of the virus that we know what they do in other variants. And there are other mutations that we don't know what they do. And it's also important, I think that this is a good insight, that we don't necessarily know how they all work together yet. We can see, a mutation here, a mutation there, and we probably, in a couple of the cases, we know what they do in isolation. But we don't necessarily know how they work together until that's specifically looked at in a lab setting. So I think we can't jump to conclusions. We can't jump to strong conclusions at this point. We can have a lot of worries. We can hope for the best, but prepare for the worst. But we don't know exactly how it will turn out. I think a wonderful scenario, I don't know if I should say this, but I think one of the better scenarios for a very infectious virus, best case scenario, is if this virus proves to be very infectious, more than Delta, is that it just causes a more mild disease. So viruses mutate not to cause more disease in people, but they mutate to become more transmissible, generally speaking. The virus, its interest, like from a evolutionary perspective, its interest is to become better at passing from person to person. That's what makes the virus biologically successful. It doesn't really gain anything if it kills people. And so if the virus circulates in humans for a very long time, it's totally possible that it becomes less dangerous over time. Very infectious, but less deadly. So that would be an okay scenario. It's not the worst scenario. It's probably better if it just goes away completely, but it's not a bad scenario if it just becomes a lot less deadly, even if it gets passed really easily. But it's also still possible that it might cause very bad disease. So we're going to have to just wait and see how that turns out.
Cool, thank you. All right, we've got a couple questions that are all kind of circling the same general question, which is, so we have one booster at 6 months for a total of 3 shots. Do we think that this is going to end up being like a flu shot situation where we update with the, mRNA for the new spike protein of the year and then update it? So it's an annual thing?
I don't know the answer to that question. I wouldn't jump to any conclusions about what will happen in this area. I will say that the flu is not like the rule here. The flu is actually quite unique. It's a very unique virus. It mutates in very unique ways, and the flu vaccine is also like sort of unique. I think it needs to be updated with newer technologies in the future, such as mRNA vaccines, so that we can make better flu vaccines that protect us all better. The COVID vaccines actually are better than the flu vaccine, at least in this time period right now, being in the pandemic for like 2 years. The immune responses are much stronger with the COVID vaccines. And we don't know how they will look 5 years out, 10 years out, or even less. So I will say that some immune responses last for life. People who are vaccinated against smallpox as children, when they were 80 years old, still had immune responses against smallpox. This is a virus that it's now extinct, thank goodness. But immune responses can last for life. So we'll need to kind of just wait and see, will it persist at a level where people are still protected from severe disease, or will it continue to go down over time, or will the virus find more and more ways to evade it? We're going to have to just wait and see what happens in that regard. I can see a couple of scenarios being possible: 3 or 4 shots and then done forever, or more regular updates when the virus mutates again. So I wouldn't bet on either of those scenarios right now.
All right, so much like the previous one, we have several questions that are kind of circling this subject. There's a lot of people who would like to know more about the immunity of people who did not get vaccinated. So those who have had COVID in the past, and how that affects how COVID will affect them in the future.
So I think this is similar to one of the original questions, where you do make an immune response against COVID when you're infected, but it's really variable. So this is one. Actually, we knew this way back in, I think, the spring or summer of 2020. When you get a COVID infection, there's lots of different outcomes for how severe your disease is, and there's lots of different outcomes for how strong your immune response is. You can have super high levels of antibodies, or you can have like almost undetectable immune responses. Those people who have really weak immune responses are susceptible to getting the virus again, and we know that a lot of people can get reinfected, and they're certainly going to be susceptible to infection with the variant. But if you get vaccinated, you have a more consistent immune response, and it's on average going to be a stronger antibody response. I think it will also have a more protection against variants. So that's how they compare. It's not it's not helpful to have immunity from prior infection. It's just more consistent and probably stronger to have it from vaccination.
Awesome. Thanks, Mike. Why do you think it's important to be vaccinated or boosted or both? And if you're boosted before the holidays?
Well, I mean, it's important to be vaccinated and boosted in general if you want to prevent the spread of COVID. Holidays are typically associated with a lot of people coming together from different geographic locations and being in close proximity for a very long period of time. So it's a great way to spread a virus around. So it's an increased risk of transmission, therefore the benefit from vaccination is greater.
Thanks.
All right. Someone's curious if taking a booster shot and then doing a rapid test or PCR or antibody test will show positive results for any of them.
Right. So the vast majority of COVID tests that look for COVID infection, whether they're PCR or a rapid antigen test, they measure a different part of the virus from the spike protein. They usually measure one of the internal proteins of the virus. I think it's almost every COVID test. And that was when the vaccines first came out. I'd be surprised if anybody now, any clinic now, would use one of the COVID tests that measured spike protein. So as far as I know, the vast majority, if not all, COVID tests measure a different part of the virus, and you would have no false positives from being recently vaccinated.
Excellent. Next up, we got a question from Nate. Speaking of the flu vaccine, how worried should we be regarding reduced efficacy of the flu vaccine this year because of the lack of surveillance or collection, just because very few people got the flu over the last 2 years?
Right. Well, there has been less circulation of flu. So generally, the background of this question that it sounds like the questioner knows about is that every year's flu vaccine is designed based on what flu viruses are circulating around the globe in the previous season. Often they look to the opposite hemisphere to see what virus is circulating in their winter. And then they predict what will probably be in their own area, and they tailor their vaccine to that strain of the virus or strains. In the pandemic, because there was so much social distancing, flu barely circulated in the US and probably in much of the world. It was almost non-existent. But that means that the virus probably got I won't say frozen in time, but the virus certainly had much less opportunity to evolve. So it's probably relatively similar to what was there before. It's not a guarantee. Sometimes when you back a virus into a corner like that, it can encourage it to mutate. But in this case, I would kind of expect it to just continue where it left off. But don't put your money on that bet either, because it's not a guarantee. But basically, I wouldn't lose any sleep over it.
All right. There are many places where masks are no longer mandatory if you are fully vaccinated. What are your thoughts on that?
Okay, so this is I think a complex issue, and it's one of these issues where I want to distinguish what the science says from what we as a society decide that we should do. So the job of science is to study the natural world and predict what will happen when we do X, Y, or Z. Predict how the virus will spread, how the vaccines will block it, to study how an intervention like mask wearing will affect the pandemic. But then a totally separate field is basically us as a society or as a government deciding what's best for people, what we want to do as a society, and that's really based on your values. So there's not a scientific answer in a lot of cases in this pandemic. It's really a political answer or a values-based answer. So the question of what is my opinion on mask mandates coming down in the pandemic? I kind of take a middle ground in that. if a local area, and this is my own personal opinion, by the way, in a local area where they have low levels of virus circulation because of high vaccination, or maybe they have a really high hospital capacity and they have a lot of ICU beds. In that case, it is a reasonable thing for a local government to say, we don't need the mask mandates because people can take their own personal responsibility to get vaccinated to protect themselves. And if they don't get vaccinated, they assume their risk. Now, in other cases, you might have lots and lots of community transmission, and you might have hospitals overrun. In that case, it makes more sense to me to do more restrictions such as mask mandates, because there can be ripple effects on the healthcare system, on people who are sick with cancer and heart attacks and not COVID. But it's this thing where I think it really comes down to what we as a society decide, like how we weigh the pros and the cons of these different outcomes. I can see it being reasonable in many cases to get rid of mandates for masking, but we have to. And the reason I say that also is because of all of the tools that we've come up with in this pandemic to fight COVID: social distancing, standing 6 feet apart, limiting capacity to stores and theaters and schools, mask wearing and vaccination. They all pale in comparison to vaccination. This is a scientific statement. The most effective method to prevent COVID of anything that we have at our disposal is vaccination. So that's really what I focus on. I worry less about all the other restrictions if we prioritize vaccination because they're so effective.
Sounds good. Let's see. We've got a question. What was the first vaccine?
Ooh, this is a great question. This is one of my favorite topics. So as far as I know, the first method that people used to immunize other people against a disease was something called variolation. And it was a method where people tried to protect people from smallpox, which was this incredibly deadly, ghastly viral infection that killed many, many people, and thankfully isn't around anymore. Basically, they gave people a little tiny dose of the actual smallpox virus. This was very crude. If it worked, you were protected from smallpox, but you actually could get too sick and you could die in that case. So it's like kind of an inoculation, but it's also kind of not a vaccine at all because you're actually giving the virus that you're trying to fight. It's not a weakened form of the virus. It's not a different virus. It's not part of the virus. It's actually the virus. You're just trying to give less of it. So it's like arguably not a vaccination, but it's what people were trying to do at the time. The first, what I would call real vaccine, where they used a trick to expose the immune system to some substance that would allow the person to safely generate an immune response to fight an infection later, was Edward Jenner was a English or Scottish physician who okay, this is kind of apocryphal. This is like the lore. I don't know if this is historical fact, but the lore is that he recognized that milkmaids were like typically thought to be beautiful women because they didn't have pockmarks on their faces from smallpox. So he said, why are these milkmaids not getting smallpox? And he found that they would sometimes get pockmarks on their hands. He said, that's strange. And then he looked at the cows that they would milk, and the cows had pockmarks on their udders. And so what he found was that the cows were being infected with cowpox, their own pox virus, different from smallpox. It caused a very mild infection in the human's hands because it's not the same virus. It's specific to cows. And then he said, we can make an inoculation out of this cow virus. And that is where the word vaccine actually came from, because vacca in Latin means cow. So it was taking this cow virus, using it to inoculate people. And that was actually the basis of how we, as a species, eliminated the smallpox virus from the globe in around the 70s or the 80s. And it was actually one of the biggest triumphs of modern medicine.
Thank you.
If I recall, the first, it wasn't it due to like scratching the skin, like you would like give like a cut and then like kind of rub the virus into that? Isn't that how they did that?
That is how they administered the smallpox vaccine. Yeah, so it's really analogous to how Edward Jenner, saw the milkmaids getting pock marks on their skin. So the smallpox vaccine that they gave up until the 70s or the 80s, they took a little bit of this pox virus from a different animal species, and then they would scratch it into. They would use something called a bifurcated needle, which was like kind of like really really tiny two-pronged metal instrument, and they would kind of like scratch the skin with a little bit of virus in it, and it would cause one smallpox, not smallpox, cause one pox lesion, and then it would resolve, and then you were protected from smallpox for life.
All right. And lastly, it looks like we have a scenario question to end on, though I do kind of wish we had ended on what was the first vaccine, because that would have been a lovely bit of trivia to end our evening on. So this is a scenario. So someone's looking for advice. This person's partner's university is not mandating students report if they get COVID. All students are vaccinated and don't wear masks in class or on campus at all. The other day, a classmate told my partner in close quarters that they had COVID over break. How concerning should it be that this could be a common occurrence on campus? Could it be leading to more spread of the virus despite vaccination status? Should we be taking more precautions than the school is mandating? And should my partner get tested?
Okay, so I think what we know, so the scientific answer is that with gradually waning immunity with new variants, the breakthrough infections are becoming more common. So it is definitely possible for individuals to get COVID who are vaccinated in these settings, or for little outbreaks to happen, or big outbreaks to happen in school settings, especially colleges, because there's a lot of socializing. That's the biggest a party, the biggest source of transmission. So that is definitely scientifically possible. Now the question is, should people worry about it? And that's not a scientific question. The risks for someone who is very young and otherwise healthy are quite low, but that person needs to consider, do they have contact with an elderly person at home? Could they potentially spread the virus to someone who is at high risk of severe COVID? That's really the most important consideration. A vaccinated young person they're not invincible to COVID, but they are so highly protected from COVID. If you are young and healthy and vaccinated and you get COVID, it is really not a severe situation. The vast majority of COVID deaths, whether they're unvaccinated people or vaccinated, are in the elderly. And so this is one of those situations where I think my personal opinion is that everyone has a personal responsibility to try to not get infected, or if they think they might be, to do reasonable things to try to not get infected, or if they think they are infected, get tested, try not to spread it, don't go into work or school when you're sick. I mean, these are kind of common sense things that should be in place all the time. But in terms of the school policy, it's one of these situations where I think the should determine for themselves what makes the most sense for them. If you have a COVID exposure, though, go get tested, because you don't want to spread it around to someone who could actually get very very sick.
I have a bit of a follow-up question for that, and forgive me if I missed the particular data point earlier. Is there a point at which, how to phrase, either vaccinated or unvaccinated, at what age does the mortality risk drastically increase? So you said the elderly, but like where do we stop counting someone as young and healthy by vaccination and COVID standards?
Right, like when do I become elderly?
Where's the cliff?
I just turned 32. Am I getting close to elderly yet? No. So it's really a like an exponential function. And so I think it's like, I don't know the exact numbers here, but it's like for every decade in life, your risk is going to increase by some amount, twofold, 2 times or 5 times or 10 times. And so, you're really low at 10 years old and 20 years old and 30 years old. I think you start to notice the risk going up a little bit when you're 40. And it goes a lot more when you're 50. Then it really goes up when you're 60 and 70 and 80. And so it goes up in this like steep curve where it's going up very, very slowly in the beginning, the risk. And then when you get 40 to 50 to 60, it becomes a much steeper increase. And as you continue to age, the risk goes up. So there's not a cutoff point. It's not like you go from being young to being elderly. It's just that as your age increases, the risk starts to increase faster and faster.
All right. Well, this was great. Thank you so much for the presentation, for all of these questions. Like, this was really, really helpful. And so I'm really glad you took the time. Thank you, Raven, for being with me and running this whole series with me. Thank you, Kay, for signing for us. Does anyone else have anything they want to add before we wrap up?
Just that to join us again in 2 weeks, I hope.
Yes, I'll send you all an email about that when it happens. And also, Skype a Scientist needs your support to keep running programs just like this. So if you can support us, please do. Any little bit helps. We're a very small and scrappy organization that doesn't have much of a staff. We've got 2 people, 3 people on a good day. And so if you can help us, that would be super, super appreciated. And you can do that. I just linked it in the chat. And so, yeah, and yes, someone just asked if this is going to be recorded. Yes, it will be on youtube.com/SkypeAScientist in about a half hour, whenever YouTube finishes processing after I upload. Thank you again, and hopefully we'll see you at the next one. Thank you all again. Bye, everyone.
Good night.
Good night. Good night.